Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Women's Diaries Voice, we retell those moments honest, everyday, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. My name is Maya Voss, and at 27, I'm raising my son Leo on my own. That truth still startles me when the apartment is quiet and his sneakers are lying neatly by the door. Small shoes that somehow carry the weight of all my choices. I didn't plan any of this. Not when I was 19. Not when my life circled neatly around juried show studio hours and grades posted outside the design department. My family liked lives that came with rubrics. My father, Der Steven Voss, measured success in quantifiable markers, test scores, surgical outcomes, the number of invitations he received to speak at conferences. My mother, Elaine, was general counsel for a regional bank and wrote emails with clauses that could cut. Our brick Tudor on Ashford Lane could have been lifted from a real estate brochure, trimmed hedges, bay windows, a slate path the color of rain. You entered into a foyer where a grandfather clock ticked like a metronome for aspiration. Every Sunday we ate at 6 without fail. The table smelled of lemon oil and the china was white with a thin silver rim. Conversation followed a choreography of accomplishments. My parents would ask about Emmeline. Emme, my little sister, a debate star with a collection of trophies that caught the light. First place again, Dad would say unsurprised, and Emme would shrug, cheeks pink. When it was my turn, I offered something about a charcoal series or an exhibit poster I designed. My mother smiled politely and turned the conversation toward real work and employable degrees. At Northbridge University, art felt like oxygen. I kept a 3.9 GPA while shelving catalogs in the campus gallery and building a portfolio that smelled like graphite and spray fixative. Professor Alvarez pulled me aside after critique one night and tapped a finger on my thumbnail sketches. "You have point of view. I'm recommending you for Harbor and Finch, the Summer Brand studio. Don't waste the chance." I said I wouldn't. I meant it. I did not tell my parents. My mother had already requested LSAT prep schedules just to see. I printed them, highlighted a few sections, and slid the packet under a chemistry textbook. My ally was Emme, who slipped into my room late, hair braided, whispering, "Show me the new pages." She hid her slim notebook of poems under my bed the way people hide contraband. I met Colin Avery on a night that smelled like cool dust and varnish. He stood too close to a sculpture and ran his fingers along the grain of a wooden arc as if he'd made it. Dark hair, immaculate watch, last name that opened doors in our city's real estate circles. He talked about negative space like it was a stock he planned to buy low and sell high. He asked questions that made me feel seen, or maybe just staged for an audience. We were a couple by midterms. When I brought him home for Sunday, my father clapped his shoulder and said, "Finally someone who understands returns." My mother poured wine and asked about postgraduate plans, practiced warmth flickering across her face like a candle in a draft. Colin fit them like a tailored jacket, and for a moment, I let myself believe that meant he fit me too. The signs came softly and then not. He hovered when I texted classmates, commented on my clothes. That top pulls focus. Wear the black one and read my phone while I showered, claiming he worried about me walking back to the studio at night. In public, he was grand and charming. In private, he conducted small audits. I told myself it was protection. I did not want to see what it was. Nadia, my roommate, saw. After a gallery opening where a classmate hugged me, Colin's jaw locked and he pulled me aside hard enough that my shoulder ached. Nadia waited until we were alone to say, "You can be brilliant without permission." I replied too quickly that he just needed time, that my parents finally approved of someone and I couldn't mess it up. The words tasted like tin. Senior year tightened into a knot, studio deadlines. Colin's demands, Sunday dinners where my father asked Colin about MBA programs while I poured water I didn't drink. Emme squeezed my hand under the table when the room tilted her palm, dry and sure. Professor Alvarez called me into her office and spoke softly. "Your lines are careful where they used to be brave. Don't let someone else edit your voice." Her sentence followed me to Colin's apartment like a stray. We fought that night, something small that cracked to reveal something larger. He criticized the friends I kept, the projects I chose, the internship I hadn't yet told my parents about. We made up because I hated the silence more than I hated being wrong. The quiet after was a weight across my ribs. I slept like a person trying not to be heard. 6 weeks later, I sat on the cool tile of Harker Hall's third-floor bathroom with a pregnancy test balanced on a folded paper towel. 2 pink lines rose like twin flags. I counted seconds backward, named all the reasons it couldn't be true stress caffeine the way time stretches during critiques. The lines kept their color. I walked to Collins with my palms open, rehearsing sentences that collapsed when I spoke. His face flickered surprise, calculation, anger. "You planned this," he said, "to keep me from leaving after graduation." The room narrowed. "That's not what happened," I told him, and he stared past me at the framed photograph of his family's boat, like it could offer better company. "There are ways to fix this," he said. "If you don't, we're done." I waited for a version of me that would be relieved to have a decision relocated into someone else's mouth. She didn't arrive. I walked home under sycamores, my hands tucked into my sleeves, and settled into a stillness that felt heavier than fear. I didn't know how to mother. I only knew that I would. Morning sickness arrived with no sense of theater. I told my parents I had a stubborn stomach bug and took on extra shifts at the gallery to avoid Sunday. I wore boxy sweaters and learned the timing of nausea like a bad metronome. Collins cycled between prolonged silences and late-night texts that vibrated with accusation. I typed replies and deleted them. The secret broke at dinner in April. My mother served lemon roast chicken and something with rosemary, and the smell rose like a wall. I excused myself and threw up quietly in the powder room off the hall with the blue and white runner. When I returned, pale and damp, my mother studied my face the way she might study a contract. "You're pregnant," she said, the sentence as flat as glass. I said yes. The truth made the room sound tinny. My father set down his fork with the exactness he reserved for delicate tools. "What is your plan?" he asked, like he was dictating notes. I told him I was keeping the baby. He said, "Not under this roof." An emergency family meeting was convened with parentheses, aunts and uncles, and my grandmother, who wore grief like a brooch. People suggested solutions that had nothing to do with me. A quick wedding, a quiet clinic, a couple who wanted to adopt. The room was full of words, and I was so close to them it felt like eavesdropping. My father ended the meeting without raising his voice. "If you insist on this path, you'll take it somewhere else." Meanwhile, Colin curated his version of events. On campus, a rumor moved faster than a fact. In group critiques, chairs scraped louder. Friends sat farther away, and my advisor, a kind woman with tired eyes, suggested a leave. "You can come back," she said, "after." The word left me nowhere to stand. Emmy stayed. She pressed granola bars into my hand and texted me lists of foods less likely to make me sick. "They'll change their minds," she whispered, but the hope sounded borrowed. The final confrontation happened over something small, a bottle of prenatal vitamins in the upstairs bathroom cabinet. My mother held it between 2 fingers. That night, my parents stood in the doorway of my room together, in a way that made it clear I stood alone. "You have 2 choices," my father said, "adoption and your education, or a life you cannot begin to imagine. You can't do both." I touched my stomach without meaning to. "I'm keeping my child," I said. He nodded like a door closing. "Then you have until Friday." The house slept like it had signed a treaty. I did not. I packed to the small sounds drawers make when you open them slowly. Jeans, a sweater I had worn into softness, sketchbooks. My zippered case of graphite and pens. From the top of my dresser, I took the walnut box with my abuela's Milagro pendant, a silver heart with a flame that used to feel ornamental and now felt like instructions. I slid my laptop into a tote and wrote 2 letters, the words inked in a hand I didn't recognize. One to my parents, explaining without apologizing. Another to Emmy with an email address and a sentence she would understand: "I'll be where the art is." I left before dawn so I wouldn't have to see the windows of the house turn gold and accuse me of being dramatic. The air was cool and smelled like wet stone. My car, a sand-colored Corolla with a dented rear bumper, coughed once and agreed to begin. I had $842 in my account and half a tank of gas. The streetlights hummed. The tires made that soft shushing sound on the asphalt like some kind of consolation. At the end of Ashford Lane, the traffic light turned green, then yellow, then red like it was practicing. I waited hands at 10 and 2, and when it shifted to green again, I eased forward the clock on the dash, clicking from 5:59 to 6 viewer, as if time itself approved. I did not look in the rearview mirror long enough to make a metaphor of it. The horizon was a pale stripe, and the sky considered blue. I pressed the accelerator with the care of a person who has just been given the keys to her own life and is still learning how to steer. I drove until the sun shook itself awake over the warehouses on the east side, and the city felt like a room someone had just opened. At a 24-hour diner called Pioneer Grill, the kind with cracked vinyl booths, and a pie carousel that turned slow as a planet. I took the corner stool and ordered coffee I barely touched. The waitress slid a plate across to me, eggs toast, a wedge of orange, and said, "You look like you're figuring something out." I was. On my phone, I typed weekly rates near me and basement studio cheap and jobs no experience mornings. The searches made a lattice I could climb. By noon, I had a place to sleep in extended lodge off the freeway, where the hallway smelled faintly of chlorine and cigarettes, and a list of apartment complexes that would require pay stubs I didn't yet possess. I changed my shirt in the motel bathroom, smoothed my hair with water from my palm, and began knocking on kitchens. Breakfast shift. "I'll show up on time. I learn fast," I said, the sentence polishing with repetition. 2 managers frowned at the horizon of my stomach as if it were weather. A third told me to try after the baby. At a bright, bustling place on Edison Avenue, the manager Bonnie Tran considered me over the rims of her readers. She had a streak of white hair like a comet and a voice that didn't waste syllables. "When are you due?" she asked. "September." "You ever carry 6 plates at once?" "I can learn." "You ever get up at 4? "I already do." She disappeared into the office and returned with a paper hat and a stack of timesheets. "Be here at 5:15 tomorrow. Breakfast is unforgiving." The motel's air unit rattled like loose change. I lay on top of the covers fully dressed and listened to trucks downshift on the freeway. There is a flavor of exhaustion that tastes like metal. It slid across my tongue and didn't leave. In the morning, I tied on an apron and learned the grammar of the line mug down coffee in a slow arc plate read at a glance ticket wheel, whispering orders like an incantation. By 10, I had burns along my wrist where the plates touched skin and a name Maya pinned over my heart in plastic cursive. After a week at the motel, I found a basement studio carved out of the back of a house in a neighborhood that had once been red-lined and now was something else people argued about in meetings. The lease was month to month. The carpet was the beige of compromise. A high window faced a strip of dirt and one determined dandelion. When the owner handed me the key, I folded the receipt carefully as if it might tear the wrong way. I tried my parents that night. Calls went to voicemail. Text bubbles turned blue and did not answer back. On the 3rd attempt, my father picked up. "It's me," I said, a beat of silence, the air pressure changing. "I know," he said, and the line died. A message from Colin arrived an hour later, so neat it felt rehearsed. "My counsel will be in touch. I want no further involvement. Do not contact me." I read it twice and blocked the number. The quiet after was loud. The next evening in the laundry room, that was 2 machines and a table missing one leg, I wrestled a damp fitted sheet into submission. A young woman with a braid so long it reached the middle of her back came in holding a toddler on one hip and a bottle of detergent in the other. "You must be new," she said, cheerful, like a note held in the throat. "I'm Rena. Upstairs 2B. This is Mira. Say hi." Mira considered me with the gravity toddlers reserved for new planets. "Hi," she said, then hid her face in Rena's shoulder. "I'm Maya," I said. Rena's eye swept the laundry basket, 2 bowls, 1 mug, a set of thrift store sheets, the sweater I wore to everything. "First apartment?" she asked gently. I nodded. "Come up tomorrow night. I make a big pot of chana masala at the end of the week. My mother would haunt me if I didn't share." At Pioneer Grill, my body learned a new geography of ache. My feet swelled in shoes that claimed to be non-slip. My lower back pulsed like a stubborn metronome, and the perfume of bacon settled into my hair like a ghost I couldn't wash out. Regulars began asking for my section. A retired mail carrier insisted on leaving 2 singles folded under his saucer for the baby's socks. A nurse in scrubs striped with coffee stains told me powdered ginger helped nausea. She was right. I kept packets of saltines in my apron and pretended that was a meal. Northbridge surprised me. After Professor Alvarez learned I was off campus, she arranged 2 independent study credits I could complete from the apartment at odd hours. "You'll send me process, not just results," she wrote. "Keep your hand honest." When I wasn't at the grill, I worked through exercises that steadied me, negative space studies, logo constraints that force clarity, a series of tiny book covers in black ink. On good days, the pen slid. On bad days, it scratched like a match that wouldn't catch. Rena's apartment smelled like cumin and tomatoes and shampoo. She had a couch that remembered your shape, a table salvaged from a church sale, a cupboard full of mismatched dishes that all had stories. Mira toddled from toy basket to bookshelf and back again, narrating her own journey. Rina watched her with the tender alertness of someone guarding a museum. Single parent, she asked me when Mira fell asleep across 2 sofa cushions, arms flung wide like a sailor. The question sat between us with its own heat. "Yes," I said. "Me too," she replied, and the room arranged itself into a different shape. She taught me where to find the community clinic and which bus lines were less mean at dusk, how to fill out forms that never had enough boxes for real life. She slid a list across the table. Faias, the Neighborhood Resource Center, a secondhand store on Maple that lets you put winter coats on layaway. "You don't have to do this like a person falling downstairs," she said. "You can hold the rail." At 27 weeks, the staff at Pioneer surprised me with a shower that made me cover my face for a second. A chocolate cake from the bakery down the block, a pack of onesies decorated with tiny moons, a used car seat with the expiration date still a year out. Bonnie gave me a set of earplugs and said, "For the hospital. You'll want to hear only what matters." I laughed, then didn't. Labor began while I was pouring coffee. At first, I thought I'd stepped in water. Then the warmth slid down my thigh, undeniable and embarrassing and holy in a way that didn't ask permission. A regular stopped me with her palm on my elbow. "Honey," she said, "you're done here." Bonnie took my keys and shouted into the kitchen for someone to cover the floor. She called Rena. Rena called her cousin. A plan happened around me as the room tilted. Breathing was a thread I followed. The drive to County General was a sequence of lights that had nothing to do with me. In triage, a nurse with a name badge that read Camille P. pressed a cool cloth to my forehead and said, "You're okay. You're already doing it." Time shortened and lengthened the way it does when the body decides. A resident with a kind, serious mouth explained that my blood pressure had a mind of its own. The monitors hummed in a key that made my teeth ache. Rina held my hand until her cousin had to relieve her, and when she left, she put a grocery bag by the chair, grapes, a phone charger, a pair of soft socks. The bag made me cry harder than the contractions. Leo arrived at 4:09 a.m., his hair damp and furious, his mouth opening like a door. 7 pounds something ounces. The number slipped away while the fact of him stayed. They placed him on my chest and he smelled like bread and rain and metal and every first thing. "Hi," I said, my voice so wrecked it wasn't mine. "We're here." The social worker, Mr. Ortega, came in the next day with a clipboard and eyes that had seen worse and better. He gave me a folder, places to call, offices that could help with diapers, a candle shop that hired new moms for 3-hour shifts during holiday rush. "Write your own list," he said. "Don't let this be it." On the discharge form in the blank for emergency contact, I listed Rena and Bonnie. The pen hovered on the 3rd line and found no one else. Back at the apartment, the refrigerator motor kicked on at a volume that could wake the new moon. Leo startled at the sound, and then learned it the way we all do, by getting tired of being surprised. Nights turned to a series of small tasks: feed change, burp, rock, repeat. Breastfeeding was a loop of failure until a lactation consultant named Lydia sat on my bed and adjusted the angle of Leo's jaw with a tenderness that felt like spell work. "He's not stubborn," she said. "He's new." After she left, the rhythm found us. Postpartum is a blunt word. The fog that slid over the days had texture and a smell and teeth. I moved through it because Leo needed me to, and because doing the next thing was smaller than doing all things. When he slept, I opened my laptop and finished the independent study modules, hand steadying in small grids and restrained curves. Lines that looked like they belonged to someone with time began to look like mine. Childcare was math that didn't add up. Bonnie cleared a corner of the back office and wedged in a travel crib. "This is between us?" "And the fire code," she said. "You take the orders, I'll listen for him." The cooks peeked in and sang half songs in Spanish and Vietnamese, and something else I didn't recognize. A dishwasher named Eddie would hand me a clean towel warm from the dryer and say, "For tiny feet." When Leo fussed, I tucked behind the ice machine and fed him with the efficiency of someone who had memorized necessity. Winter brought its particular arithmetic. The gas bill looked like a dare. I lost. When Leo coughed, a deep, sticky sound that made his whole body work. Rena took us to urgent care, and from there we were sent to pediatrics, where the lights were a kind of bright that made the edges of things too sharp. A night nurse with a purple streak in her hair, Nurse Danny, found crackers I didn't have to pay for, and an extra blanket that didn't itch. She said, "Fill out this energy assistance form before you go. It cuts the bill in half for 3 months." Leo slept finally. Face uncreased, his breath whistling on the exhale like a secret joke. December iced the world and thawed it again. At the grill, a busser taped a drawing of a snowman to the office wall, and Leo stared at it like a masterpiece. I made paper garlands out of the takeout menus and hung them around the window frame of the apartment. When the radiator clicked on, the garlands lifted and fell like a creature breathing. On a Tuesday, between the breakfast rush and the 11 o'clock crowd, the staff pushed 2 tables together and set out a tray of sugar cookies with too much frosting. Leo wore a hat with ears someone had knit. For a second, the room wasn't borrowed, it was ours. Between feedings and shifts, I took small design jobs scavenged from community boards and the gallery's alumni group. A florist wanted a Valentine flyer. A barber needed a price card that didn't look like it had been printed at the DMV. A corner coffee stand Juniper Bean asked for a logo that made the owner cry in a good way. I set prices low enough to make people say yes, and high enough to remind myself this was work. The laptop lived on the kitchen counter beside the dish rack. With my foot, I rocked Leo's bouncer until the shape of a word mark clicked into place. The days still blurred, but in the blur were edges I could hold. By spring, Leo's laugh arrived. It was impossible to narrate without resorting to words that embarrassed me, so I didn't narrate. I saved it. Rena and I traded hours. She took evenings at the clinic front desk, while I watched Mira build towers and knock them down. On mornings, I handed Leo over, kissed his hair that always smelled faintly of milk, and sprinted to the grill. We learned each other's thresholds and left food on each other's stoves, dal in my pot chicken soup in hers, biscuits cooling on my counter, with a note that said, "Eat before you forget." The call that shifted something came from the owner of Juniper Bean. "A friend brought her boss last week," she said. "He runs a small marketing firm and liked your logo. He wants to know if you take freelance." The first project menu boards for a brewery's food truck paid more than a week of tips. The second, a seasonal campaign for a local bookstore, paid my past due gas bill and left something still in the account. I reduced my hours at the grill to 4 mornings. Bonnie said, "As long as you tell me first, kid." Leo turned one with a cupcake and a candle he didn't know what to do with. He smeared frosting into his hair and looked offended when I laughed. I printed a photo on cheap paper and taped it to the wall. The memory box on the shelf above the sink filled the way a creek fills slowly, relentlessly. Hospital bracelet, the tag from his first real coat, a napkin with a crayon handprint, the parking stub from the day we got discharged. Work continued in irregular waves. Some weeks brought 3 jobs at once. Others were a desert that taught me what waiting feels like in the body. I said yes when Professor Alvarez asked if I could zoom into a sophomore critique and talk about process. Seeing the studio on my screen made my throat tight. The taped-off floor, the pinned studies, the gray light I'd lived inside. When a student asked how I kept drawing with all the life stuff, I said small often and clicked to the next slide. By the time Leo was nearly 2, a food blog that mattered locally featured a restaurant I'd helped rename and rebrand Cedar and Salt, and posted a photo of the sign I'd painted on plywood at Rena's table, while Mira dipped her brush in water and insisted she was helping. Inquiries arrive the way the first snowflakes do, one then two, then the sky with its mind made up. I raised my rates a fraction and made contracts with my name at the top and terms that protected the time I needed to be a person and a mother. With steadier invoices, the basement studio began to feel like what it was, a beginning that had given everything it could. I looked at one-bedroom listings in neighborhoods where the streetlights worked and the sidewalks did not give up halfway down the block. When a landlord in Maple Grove agreed to a rent I could meet if nothing went wrong, I said yes before I could remember how to hesitate. Rena and I borrowed a friend's truck and moved us in 4 trips. The bedroom was small but a room. I painted it a color the swatch called linen and pushed Leo's crib under the only window. He stood holding the rail and watched leaves move like language. On the first night in the new place, we ate pasta from bowls on the floor, our table still an idea. Leo fell asleep in his new room, with one hand on the blanket's edge, as if he were anchoring it to the mattress. I sat at the borrowed desk I'd wedged against the living room wall and answered emails with my shoes off. The apartment had sounds I didn't yet know: the hiss of the radiator, the upstairs neighbor's steady tread, the politely distant siren from 2 streets over. I listened until the sounds began their introductions. In the morning, light came clean through the blinds and made bars across the floor. On the corner of that light, my phone buzzed twice, once with a deposit notification for a completed job, and once with a new inquiry that began, "Hello, Maya, we were referred by..." I set the phone down and stood in the doorway to the bedroom, watching the rise and fall of Leo's breath, the small square of sun starting to climb the wall like a body learning how to stand. The morning light that crossed the new apartment floor turned out to be reliable. Leo learned to chase it. I learned to count on it. The work that had arrived like weather kept arriving. I took calls at the borrowed desk while Leo stacked blocks into precarious towers and knocked them down with a solemnity that made me laugh without sound. At Maple Grove Preschool, he clung to my coat the first week and sobbed in a low, outraged register when I tried to leave. I sat in the car 3 doors down with my forehead against the steering wheel until the teacher texted, "He's painting now. Blue mostly." When I picked him up, his hands were stained and his pockets held 3 pebbles he called treasures, and the teacher leaned in to whisper, "He told me rockets are louder than thunder." The ache in my chest rearranged itself into pride that felt almost unfamiliar, the work multiplied by referral. The Juniper Bean logo showed up on a neighborhood blog. A property manager asked for window graphics. A nonprofit wanted a poster that didn't look like an apology. I raised my rates in tiny increments and stopped apologizing when I said them out loud. A creative director named Janelle Hart, mother of 3 blazer sleeves always pushed to the elbow, found me through a bookstore campaign and asked me to take on a monthly retainer for 2 of her small business clients. "You've got taste and endurance," she said over coffee, as if listing the 2 elements required to keep anything upright. We moved through small markers that could be mistaken for accidents. If you didn't look closely, a table that was ours, not borrowed, a mattress with a frame, a secondhand hatchback whose air conditioning worked and whose back seat didn't smell faintly of fryer oil. Leo named the car Silver Fish and insisted on padding it before every ride. I opened a separate account just for taxes and another for emergencies and fed them both in slivers. The numbers grew the way plants do in quiet. Questions arrived with Leo's sentences. In the bath, he arranged his plastic dinosaurs around the edge and asked, "Where's my grandma? Where's my grandpa?" I rinsed shampoo from his hair and answered carefully, "They live in another part of the city. They haven't met us yet." He considered this, then asked the follow-up that mattered to him. "Do they like dinosaurs?" "You can ask them," I said, unsure when that would be true. "There are conversations you can't have with a child." I had them in a small office with twined ivy on a shelf where the books were soft at the corners. Dr. Noor Wallace at the Ash Street Counseling Center spoke in a way that left room between sentences. "You've survived by outrunning," she said, not unkindly. "You don't have to sprint here." We talked about the way my father's certainty lodged itself in my ribs, the way my mother's gaze could make my choices feel like smudges on glass, the way I still turned good news into arguments to preempt their objections. I left her office lighter, and then heavy again, and then a different kind of steady that held. Spring slid into summer. The workroom I carved out of our living room spilled into boxes that didn't close. The printer hummed even in my dreams. Janelle nudged me toward a sublease in a converted textile mill on the river bare brick open windows light that came in like a favor. The rent was barely logical, but the math changed when I could meet clients somewhere that wasn't my kitchen. I signed for Studio 3C with a pen that smudged and bought a plant that would forgive me if I forgot it for a week. Leo and I took a picture under the new sign Voss design in a typeface I'd agonized over for 3 days. He held up 3 fingers because he was 3. I held up the keys because I didn't know what else to hold. That week, I bought a second monitor, and after Leo fell asleep, I learned how quiet a space could be when it was not a compromise but a decision. The parent group at Maple Grove introduced me to other people who had learned to stretch days until they covered what needed covering. We traded sick day childcare and hand-me-down snow pants and long text messages at midnight that said simply, "You're not crazy." It's hard. Rena became family the way some people do when you are not paying attention, and then suddenly you are. We swapped evenings, shared grocery runs, and designated a corner of my studio as the kid spot where Mira and Leo could line up crayons as if they were train cars. The food blog that mattered more than it should featured Cedar and Salt the restaurant, whose name and sign I'd made at Rena's table, while Mira snored on the couch, and Leo drooled onto my thigh. The piece used the word luminous about the lettering. Inquiries landed in my inbox with surprising competence messages, with subject lines that included deadlines and budgets, the digital equivalent of a handshake that didn't crush your fingers. I hired a part-time virtual assistant named Kaori, who lived 2 time zones away and liked lists the way some people like sweets. "You need a calendar that says no for you," she wrote. I gave her the password to a life I had spent years padlocking. On a Thursday night in late August, when the light outside tilted gold, and Leo fell asleep holding a dinosaur by the tail, an email from Emmy arrived. The subject read, "Maya, can we talk?" The body was longer, and not her sentences a mix of our teenage code and a woman's measured care. Granddad had a scare, he's stable now. Mom's been different, Dad too. They asked about you. They asked about Leo. I don't know how to do this without breaking it. The room narrowed to the keyboard. I read it twice, and the part of me that was still 19 stood up very fast. My first response lived in drafts, a paragraph that burned too hot. I closed the laptop and washed Leo's cup, and then washed it again. At Dr. Wallace's the next afternoon, I read the email out loud. She didn't look surprised. "What outcome would feel least harmful to you?" she asked, "and safest for Leo?" The question didn't swerve to forgiveness or fault. It stayed where I could reach it. I wrote back to Emma that evening from Studio 3C, the river throwing light at the walls. "Thank you for telling me. You can give them this email address. I'll decide what contact looks like and when. I'm protecting Leo first." Emmy replied with a heart she would never have used when we were girls, and a single word. "Okay." 3 days later, an email arrived from my mother's address. It was typed like a formal letter, the kind she might send across a negotiating table. "Dear Maya, we hope this message finds you well. We would like to speak when you feel comfortable. With care, Elaine and Stephen Voss." It acknowledged nothing and gestured toward everything. I waited 2 days and sent my phone number with 3 hours circled in my calendar when I wouldn't be on a call or at pickup. My mother phoned at the beginning of the first window. "Hello, Maya," she said, and the years folded and didn't. We spoke about weather and the neighborhood I lived in, and then carefully about Leo. When she asked for a picture, I said, "Not yet." She took the boundary like a person not used to being handed anything, and said, "I understand," and for once I believe she might. My father joined on the second call, his voice precise, his sentences balanced on their own weight. "Emmy tells us you have a studio," he said as if it were a species. "You're employing people." "1 part-timer," I said, "and contractors." He inhaled as if preparing to speak a difficult language. "That's impressive," he said, the word square-shouldered and awkward coming from him. "They asked to meet Leo." I did not say yes or no. I made an appointment with Leo's therapist, a child specialist at the same clinic, who taught me how to frame the idea to a small person without lending it unnecessary drama. At breakfast on Saturday, I asked Leo, "Would you like to meet your grandparents at a park where there's a big slide?" He considered approval the way he considered everything. Are they nice? They're learning, I said. He nodded, satisfied by the logic. Do they like dinosaurs? You can ask. We chose Hawthorne Park with a playground and a field large enough to create space if we needed space. Emma arrived first in a green dress that made her look older and exactly like herself. She hugged me with her face in my neck and said, I'm sorry. So quietly it barely counted as sound. My parents came across the grass together, not touching. My father's hair was fully gray now, and my mother's posture had lost a sliver of height. It was small but visible. Leo pressed himself to my leg and then peeked around my thigh. Emmy crouched. This is your Aunt Emme. I loved your mom when she wore terrible eyeliner. Leo smiled like a person recognizing a joke's shape. He showed her his Stegosaurus and corrected her when she called it a Triceratops. Introductions were handshakes that pretended not to want hugs. We stayed on benches near the sandbox. Leo edged closer to my father with the cautious curiosity he reserved for dogs and trucks. What's that one? He asked, pointing to a dinosaur on the book he'd brought. This is Ankylosaurus, my father said, voice softening as if someone had turned a dial. It has a tail like a mace. Leo blinked. What's a mace? A very old kind of hammer. They built a shared language in the space of a minute. My mother watched them with a hunger that might have been love. After an hour, we were out of charming small talk. Leo asked to try the swings, and Emma took him her steps long and easy. She kept one hand on his back as she pushed, and he threw his legs forward like he'd invented joy. My mother shifted closer on the bench. You've done extraordinarily, she said. And it wasn't a compliment, it was a report. He's wonderful. He is, I said. We stood to leave, and my father surprised himself by asking, would it be possible at some point to see your studio? Where you work? I looked at his face to see whether he meant inspect. He looked like a man hoping to be invited somewhere he had no right to be. Maybe, I said. Not yet. More calls followed, longer, less careful. We didn't trade apologies so much as inventory. The nights in my car outside the preschool, the freezer meals my mother had once stacked in our kitchen when my grandmother's hip went bad. The particular winter, my father slept 2 hours a night because a resident had missed something and he refused to miss anything again. None of it explained what they'd done. All of it created a context that sat next to the fact like a person in a waiting room. Janelle dropped by the studio one afternoon with a box of proofs and asked, "You okay?" in the exact tone people use when they are prepared to hear either answer. I told her in pieces. She listened, then said, "Put your boundaries in the calendar too." It was such an obvious instruction that I wrote block in 3 places and honored it the way I honored deadlines. Leo grew into 4, and then almost 5 with a speed that made his pants shorter overnight. He brought home finger-painted skies and a teacher's note that used the phrase advanced spatial sense. I signed him up for Saturday morning art at the Rivertown Children's Center and watched from the doorway as he held a brush the way he held his breakfast spoon, decisive, slightly left of center, undeterred. By late fall, after months of measured contact, my parents asked if they could visit where we lived. It wasn't a test exactly. It was an event to be prepared for with the same clarity I'd brought to client meetings. I cleaned in the way you clean when you want a room to say a sentence on your behalf. I rearranged nothing essential, just folded blankets, wiped fingerprints from the picture frames on the hallway wall, put Leo's rock collection in a shallow bowl instead of a cup. In therapy, Dr. Wallace watched me describe my preparations the way you'd watch a dancer warming up. "You're trying to align before an audit," she said. "But there's no auditor, there's you." I nodded, because arguing would have been a stall. The night before they came, Leo fell asleep on the couch with a book across his chest and one sock halfway off. I carried him to bed and stood in the doorway the way I do when I want to memorize a room. In the kitchen, I set water to boil, even though I didn't want tea, and checked the intercom to make sure it still chirped. The plant in the studio drooped and forgave me. I watered it anyway. The apartment breathed as if it had lungs. I sat at the table and let my hands be still. They arrived on time the way my family has always honored clocks. The intercom chirped at 11 sharp. In the lobby, Mr. Hayes at the front desk said, "Good morning, Ms. Voss," and my mother's mouth opened just slightly at the name she hadn't said aloud in years. The elevator required a key fob. My father noticed the secure click the way the doors closed without shutter. Inside the apartment was itself sun along the floorboards. Leo's rock bowl on the console, a line of watercolor moons taped at his height. I'd set out glasses on the counter and a plate of crackers, as if hospitality were a dialect we all still spoke. My mother carried a plant in brown paper, the leaves glossy, the pot heavy enough to suggest intention. My father held nothing hands empty, like he'd remembered to arrive unarmed. Leo peeked around the hallway and then made the decision children make. Quickly, he walked out with his stegosaurus and a serious face. "Hi," he said. "This is Spike." My mother bent to his level. "Hello, Spike," she answered, and only then. "Hello, Leo." He nodded once, satisfied by the order of operations. They toured the home like visitors at a museum that used to be theirs. The gallery wall in the hallway stopped to my mother first. Hospital bracelet, first tooth taped to a card, the photo where Leo's ears disappeared under a hat with bear ears. She reached toward a frame and drew her hand back before touching the glass. Something in her shoulder gave. She stood very still. My father paused at the doorway to the work corner. Dual monitors, a metal flat file, a string of proofs pinned with binder clips. The Voss design stencil leaned against the wall paint still caught in its corners. "These are all yours," he said, a question he didn't quite make a question. "They are." He took one step closer to read the small plaque from the Ad Federation mounted above the desk. He had to squint. He didn't put on his glasses. I didn't know he began and then stopped because the sentence had nowhere decent to go. We sat in the living room. Leo chose the place beside my father and opened a book to the page with the ankylosaur. "This one has a tail like a hammer," he said. My father smiled without showing teeth. A mace, he offered the word landing softly. They worked out a taxonomy of tail weapons, while my mother watched her hands folded around her knee, like she was anchoring herself. When the book closed, the room shifted its weight. My mother cleared her throat once. "I need to say something plain," she said, looking at my face, and then at the carpet, and then back at my face. "We were wrong. We left you when you needed us. I cannot fix the years we weren't here." The sentences were careful, and still like stones set in a path. My father held his breath the way surgeons do when they use a blade. We told ourselves we were protecting futures. He said each word equidistant from the next. We were protecting our pride. "I am sorry." He blinked too fast and looked down, surprised by water. "I hear you," I said, because it was the only truthful phrase I could offer without promising anything I couldn't deliver. I poured water we didn't drink. "I have conditions," I added, and my mother nodded as if she'd been waiting for a test. "No opinions about how I raise my son, visits on my schedule, and his capacity. If we're going to continue, we do it with a family therapist present at first. And you write me, each of you, the story of the choice you made then and the one you're making now. For clarity. For Leo when he's older." I wasn't sure if I'd planned to say all of it out loud. It sounded intact in the room. "Yes," my mother said immediately. My father looked to her and then to me. "Yes," he said, and the word wasn't elegant, it was useful. Leo tugged at my father's sleeve. "Do you want to see my room?" His ordinary sweetness cut the air like light. They followed him down the hall, and he narrated everything: the blanket with rockets, the jar of shiny rocks, the upside-down poster of the solar system I hadn't fixed yet. In the kitchen, my mother leaned her forehead against the cabinet briefly, like she'd been walking a long time and had found a tree. They left with slow movements, as if hurrying might shatter whatever we'd placed carefully between us. At the door, my father asked, almost shy, "May I keep this?" He held Leo's crayon drawing 4 figures under a crooked window. The smallest, labeled Leo. 2 taller figures, labeled Mom and Emma. 2, off to the side, labeled Grandma and Grandpa, standing near what might be a car or a cloud. "Yes," Leo said, and my father folded the paper too neatly, and then unfolded it and slid it into a book instead. On the balcony afterward, Leo licked melting popsicles and reported Grandpa knows about dinosaur bones. "He fixes people bones." "He does," I said. The city slipped from afternoon into its evening version. I felt both emptied and steadied. Their letters arrived the next week. My mother's typed on heavy paper, my father's in a pen that wavered once on a curve, evidence of a hand not used to confessing. I read them at the table, and then again on the floor. I didn't write back notes in the margins like I wanted to. I put them in a folder labeled Family and set it on the bookshelf above the flat file. The first session with Dr. Hewitt, the family therapist, was precise, the way new stitches are precise. We sat in chairs that didn't match and negotiated ground rules we had already half discussed in my kitchen. My mother cried when she realized the chair pocket held a box of tissues. My father answered 2 questions, with job stories, caught himself on the third, and tried again without armor. Recovery isn't linear, Dr. Hewitt said, and no one pretended it was. There were setbacks. A visit where my mother brought a sweater for Leo that I had to return because wool made his skin riot. She took it as a rejection until I said the word eczema out loud, and she wrote it on a post-it like a password. A phone call where my father suggested a gifted pull-out program, and I felt the old stiffness of being steered. We paused contact for a week, and then resumed with the word suggest, placed on a shelf where it couldn't fall on anyone. There were good ordinary days, too. Sundays when they met us at Hawthorne Park, and my father pushed Leo on the swing with his hands at exactly the right place on the small of the back, measured and sure. Afternoons where my mother sat on the floor building a city from blocks and let Leo change the rules midway without correcting him once. Work continued. Studio 3C gathered momentum, like a body picking up its own feet. Rina and Mira came over on Fridays with grocery bags, and my mother learned how to slice shallots the way Rina does, thin enough to turn translucent in oil. At Leo's 5th birthday, there were 2 cakes because that's how logistics worked out, and no one fought about it. Emmy refereed musical chairs and cheated openly to make the last child smile. When school showcase season came, Leo's landscape hung at child height along a hallway painted a tired yellow. He wore a shirt he called his artist shirt, and when he saw his name printed on a card, he stood very straight. My parents stood to one side and introduced themselves to other adults with a phrase that felt new in their mouths. "We're Leo's grandparents." The words held. On the drive home, my father asked, "How did you do this?" Not accusatory, but genuinely puzzled, as if observing a bridge where he had expected a river. I kept both hands on the wheel and answered with the closest thing I had to accuracy. "One day at a time," I said. With people who showed up. That night, after Leo fell asleep with dried poster paint at the cuticles of his nails, we sat at the kitchen table, just the 2 of us, me and the woman I had become in rooms like this. The apartment hummed the way it does when everything is plugged in and resting. The plant from my mother's hands had found its spot by the window and learned the pattern of the afternoon sun. On the hallway wall, the frames didn't move, but they seemed fuller somehow, like a story expanding behind glass. In the quiet, the life we'd built stayed where it was entire. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.